The year was 1942, and the city of Detroit smelled like iron and fire. It had always smelled that way, even before the war, back when the automobile assembly lines ran day and night and the workers moved with the rhythmic precision of men who had learned to measure their lives in shifts rather than seasons. But in the autumn of 1942, that smell had changed in a way that people who lived there would struggle for the rest of their lives to describe. It wasn't just metal burning anymore. It was purpose. It was urgency. It was something close to desperation dressed up in the clothes of patriotism, and every man and woman who walked through the factory gates each morning felt it pressing down on their shoulders the moment they clocked in. Eddie Carr was 31 years old and had been working the floor of the Chrysler tank arsenal since April of that year, 6 months after Pearl Harbor had turned the entire country upside down overnight. He wasn't a soldier. He had tried to enlist, walked right down to the recruitment office on a cold January morning with his coat buttoned to the throat and his jaw set with the kind of determination you only see in men who are terrified of what they're about to do, and the doctor had looked at his left knee, the one shattered in a factory accident in 1938, and shaken his head without even the courtesy of making it seem like a difficult decision. Eddie had walked home in the snow and sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours without taking off his coat, and when his wife Clara came home from her shift at the telephone exchange and found him sitting there in the dark, she didn't say anything at first. She just put her hand on top of his, and that was enough to break something open in him that he hadn't even realized he'd been keeping shut. "I have to do something," he finally said. "I can't just sit here and let other men die for me." Clara, who was the daughter of a Welsh coal miner and had inherited from him a directness that bordered on surgical, looked at him steadily and said, "Then build something that keeps them alive." That was, as it turned out, exactly what he would do. The Chrysler tank arsenal was a marvel that the newspapers were already calling the arsenal of democracy, though the men on the floor mostly called it the oven, because the heat generated by the welding torches and the forge presses and 10,000 bodies working in close quarters produced a temperature that made the winters outside feel almost pleasant by comparison. The plant had been converted from automobile manufacturing in less than a year, a transformation so rapid and so complete that military officials from Washington had toured it with expressions of barely concealed disbelief, as though they had expected to find chaos and found instead something close to a miracle. In the space of months, men who had been building Plymouths and Dodges were now building M4 Sherman tanks, and they were building them at a rate that would have seemed like fantasy just 2 years earlier. Eddie worked the welding stations on the lower hull assembly line, and in those early months he was not especially remarkable. He was competent, careful, methodical, a man who understood instinctively that the difference between a good weld and a poor one was not merely a matter of craftsmanship but potentially the difference between a 20-year-old boy in France coming home to his mother or not coming home at all. That understanding lived in his hands every single day, and it made him slower than some of the other welders, more deliberate, more inclined to stop and check his work twice when the line supervisor was already pushing everyone to move faster. He took the criticism without much argument, because he had no language for what he was feeling. That didn't sound grandiose or strange. How do you explain to a line supervisor who is worried about output numbers that you keep seeing a face every time you put your torch to the steel? Not any face he knew. Just a face. Young. Tired. Somewhere cold. His closest friend on the floor was a man named Roosevelt Gibbs, who everyone called Rosie despite the fact that he stood 6 feet 2 and had hands the size of dinner plates. Rosie had come up from Alabama 2 years before the war to chase work in the northern factories and had found it, along with a particular kind of loneliness that the North was very good at producing in men who arrived from somewhere else. He worked the riveting station next to Eddie's welding post, and the two of them had fallen into the easy rhythm of men who spend enough time in close quarters that conversation becomes unnecessary for long stretches, which was fortunate given the noise on the floor, and then suddenly essential the moment they stepped outside into the cold air for their 10-minute break. "You read about Kasserine?" Rosie asked one evening in February of 1943, sitting on an overturned crate with his lunch pail on his knee. He said it the way men on the floor had started saying it, quietly, the way you say the name of something that frightens you. Eddie had read about it. Everyone had. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, where American forces in North Africa had met Rommel's experienced German armor and been pushed back in a defeat so thorough and so public that the newspapers had struggled to find language that was honest without being devastating. American tanks had burned. American boys had died in them. And the primary reason, according to the reports trickling out of North Africa and through the worried conversations on every factory floor in Detroit, was that the German tanks were better. The German 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's own gun was nearly useless. The German Panther and Tiger tanks had armor that American shells bounced off of like stones thrown against a wall. And there were men in Washington and in field headquarters in North Africa who were beginning to say, in voices that they kept carefully controlled, that they were asking American boys to go to war in an inferior machine. Eddie set down his coffee and looked out at the parking lot where a thin skin of new snow was catching the yellow light from the factory windows. He thought about the face he kept seeing when he welded. He thought about the boy in that face, who was somewhere he'd never been, doing something Eddie couldn't do, in a machine that might not be good enough to keep him alive. "We have to build more of them," Eddie said finally. "And we have to build them faster. And we have to build them right." It was not a complicated thought. It was not a strategic insight or a tactical observation. It was just a man who understood, in the marrow of his bones, that what happened on his factory floor and what happened on a battlefield 6,000 miles away were not two separate stories. They were the same story. And he had a role in it, whether anyone gave him a medal for it or not. The months that followed were the hardest of Eddie's life in ways that had nothing to do with the work itself, though the work was genuinely brutal. He began taking extra shifts, coming in on Sundays when the line ran at half capacity and the floor was quieter and you could hear yourself think over the hiss of the welding arc. He started talking to the engineers, asking questions that were probably not in his job description, learning things about armor plating and hull geometry and the weight distribution problems that were causing some of the early Shermans to tip dangerously when they tried to fire on a hillside slope. He wasn't trying to redesign the tank. He wasn't qualified to do that. But he was trying to understand it, because he believed, and this belief was the closest thing to a religion that Eddie Carr had ever managed, that a man who understood what he was building was a better builder than a man who didn't. Clara noticed the change in him and she said nothing about it, which was her way of saying everything. She started bringing his lunch to the factory twice a week because she knew he was forgetting to eat. She stopped asking when he would be home for dinner, because the answer had become variable in a way that made a fixed dinner hour seem like a relic of another life. She was not a woman who wore sacrifice on her face like a decoration, and she didn't now. But there were evenings when Eddie came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a letter from her brother in her hand, her brother Tommy, who was somewhere in the Pacific on a destroyer escort, and he would sit down next to her and they would hold on to each other in the kitchen in the dark, not saying anything because there was nothing to say that the silence didn't already contain. Tommy's letters were careful things, written under the watchful eye of military censors who had removed anything that might reveal location or movement. So they arrived as strange documents of negation, full of things Tommy could not mention and places he could not name, with little windows of real feeling opening up in unexpected places. He wrote once about a sunset that he described with an uncharacteristic precision, going on for nearly half a page about the exact color of the light on the water, and Eddie understood, reading it, that Tommy was afraid and was trying to put something beautiful between himself and that fear. He thought about that for days afterward. He thought about it while he was welding. By the spring of 1943, the production numbers at Chrysler's tank arsenal had reached a scale that was starting to attract serious attention from people who tracked such things. The plant was producing Sherman tanks at a rate that had seemed wildly optimistic when it was first projected, and then had become the baseline, and then had been exceeded. Other plants across the country, Fisher Body in Detroit, the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Pennsylvania, Pressed Steel Car in Illinois, were doing the same, each of them contributing to a flood of American armor that was beginning to build up at ports and staging areas, ready to be shipped to theaters of war across the globe. The sheer industrial output of the United States in those years remains almost impossible to comprehend in human terms, because it is the kind of number that exists more comfortably as an abstraction than as a reality. But on the factory floor, it wasn't an abstraction. It was Eddie Carr's hands, and Rosie Gibbs's hands, and the hands of hundreds of thousands of men and women across the country who were building the war one shift at a time. Rosie got a letter of his own that spring, from his younger brother James, who was training with an armored unit in the American South before shipping out to England. James wrote that he was going to be a tank driver, which Rosie received with a mixture of pride and a fear so acute he had to step away from the riveting station for a few minutes. When he came back, his face was composed in the careful way that men compose their faces when they are not going to talk about what they're feeling, and Eddie gave him space because he knew the language of that particular silence. But 2 days later, during their break, Rosie said, "James is going to be in one of these." He gestured back at the factory with his head, meaning the tanks. "He's going to drive one of the ones we build." Eddie looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. "Then we build it right," Eddie said. "We've been building it right," Rosie said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite anger and not quite grief and was maybe just the specific kind of love that expresses itself as insistence. "Then we build it more right," Eddie said. Rosie made a sound that was almost a laugh and looked away, and they finished their break in silence, and when they went back inside Eddie welded with the particular focus of a man who has been given a name to put on the face he keeps seeing. James Gibbs. Somewhere in the American South. Learning how to drive a machine that Eddie was building. And after James, there would be another boy, and another, 10,000 boys who would climb into something assembled from the work of Eddie's hands and Rosie's hands and the hands of everyone in that enormous, sweltering, magnificent factory, and take it to places neither of them would ever see, and do things with it that neither of them would ever fully understand. The production numbers kept climbing. The ships kept loading. And somewhere far away, on the other side of an ocean that was full of submarines and fire and men trying to stay alive, a war was waiting for what Detroit was sending.